depending on where you're listening from. So happy to be hosting this this conversation with experts on international environmental justice. My name is Jose Coronado Flores. I'll be moderating, but really making sure to give the word to the experts that are here to present. And I want to briefly acknowledge that we will be doing some live Spanish to English interpretation for Gloria Rodriguez. And I'm ready to start. So I just want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Jose Coronado Flores. I'm a climate research and policy analyst for the organization CASA. And we're a Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Georgia based organization that focuses on immigrant advocacy and services. I'm originally from Guatemala, a country that is at high risk of the issues that climate change will bring, particularly the dry corridor where my family is from. Guatemala is also a country that suffers a lot from air pollution as well as just waste. Some recent environmental degradation due to narco activity, lots of things. So this issue is really important to me. But with that, I'm gonna give the word to each one of our panelists to just introduce themselves, and shortly we'll begin each one of their longer presentations. So, Gloria, te invito a presentarte. Gloria, no se escucha.
Muchísimas gracias, un cordial saludo. Les hablo desde Bogotá, Colombia, desde un país que desafortunadamente, con gran tristeza debo señalar hoy, es el país donde existen mayor cantidad de conflictos ambientales y de asesinatos como consecuencia de lo que tiene que ver con la conservación de la biodiversidad, lo que tiene que ver con el enfrentamiento de las comunidades alrededor de proyectos extractivistas en nuestro país. Yo soy abogada. Sí, experta en investigación y adicionalmente soy en este momento magistrada de la de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Soy además investigadora de la Universidad del Rosario.
Hi, my name is Gloria. I'm a specialist and magistrate in justice. And I come from a country where, unfortunately and sadly, we have like one of the greatest numbers of death, right? Because of in cases of environmental justice. Well, that's it.
Thank you, Gloria. Next, Dr. Kashwan, if you'd like to briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. My name is Prakash Kashwan. I'm an associate professor of environmental studies at Brandeis University. And most of my research focuses on questions of climate and environmental justice. I have done quite a bit of research in India and other parts of Global South. As you know, India is sort of almost like the headquarters of inequalities in many ways, many different types of inequalities that, sometimes people don't know about. In recent years, I've also been conducting comparative research between US and Global South kind of environmental justice perspectives. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone and interacting with the audiences as well.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And then I'll pass it to Dr. Marquez.
Hello, I'm Dr. Shannon Marquez. I'm the Dean of Global Engagement at Columbia University. I'm also on the faculty in the Mailman School of Public Health and the Columbia Climate School, where I teach courses in global health, water sanitation and hygiene, and environmental health issues. Most of my work has focused on this intersection between addressing global challenges, diversity, equity, and environmental justice, with a particular focus on achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in low and middle income countries. I do lots of field work, most recently in West Africa and in Cuba, again, looking at these climate justice and environmental health issues. It's a pleasure to be here today.
And we're so happy to have you. And then I'll pass the word to Anahira if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Kia ora everybody, morning from where I am. My name is Anahira Nin. I'm based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I am an Indigenous person who is also a member of several tribes here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My background is in international relations, Indigenous rights and interests, and environmental policy. And my current substantive role is leading Indigenous climate policy for the Ministry for the Environment for the New Zealand Government. I also have a few other roles that enable me to keep progressing better outcomes for my communities, specifically my tribes here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So just to provide a bit of context, I will be providing kind of some insights into the environmental justice issues that posed specifically to Māori communities here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then sharing kind of how we're looking to address those issues and several strategies and actions being enacted to help address them. Thank you.
No, thank you. Really an amazing set of individuals here. And now let's get into the details of what everybody's working on and what they all want you to know. So the first person I'm going to invite to present is Professor Rodriguez. So feel free to share your screen and begin your presentation. And I'll also invite people to send questions, and as time allows, we'll be able to answer them. Todavía no se ve.
¿Inicio?
Sí,
Perfecto.
perfecto.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias. Agradezco mucho esta invitación. Creo que es muy importante que hablemos de la justicia ambiental.
Thank
La
you very
justicia-
much. I appreciate this invitation, and I think it's very important to talk about environmental justice.
El tema de la justicia ambiental ha cogido gran relevancia, especialmente en este momento en Latinoamérica, como consecuencia no solamente de los conflictos ambientales, sino también del Acuerdo de Escazú.
Environmental justice has a great influence nowadays. Sorry. Right.
Especialmente por el tema del Acuerdo de Escazú. El Acuerdo de Escazú, que tiene que ver, por supuesto, con esas grandes temáticas de la justicia ambiental.
Especially because of the Escazú agreement that are related to those issues related to environmental justice.
La participación, el acceso a la información, la justicia, tanto a nivel administrativo como judicial, son elementos fundamentales para tener en cuenta en el tema del concepto de justicia ambiental.
Judicial and administrative law are essential constructs to bear in mind the concept of environmental justice.
No existe un consenso sobre qué es justicia ambiental.
There isn't a consensus on what the environmental justice is.
Sin embargo, los análisis que se han realizado en Colombia, especialmente desde los análisis de los jueces, nos han llevado a hablar de 4 elementos importantes de la justicia ambiental.
But the analysis made in Colombia, especially the ones made from judges, lead us to talk about the 4 main concepts related to environmental justice.
En primer lugar, debemos señalar que justicia ambiental significa, además, que se cuente con un sistema democrático y de participación.
First, we need to highlight that environmental justice has to do with having a system, a democratic system that counts on participation.
Eso quiere decir que quienes se ven afectados por los proyectos, por la contaminación, por todo lo que tiene que ver con los efectos ambientales, especialmente del proceso productivo, deben ser tenidos en cuenta y su voz debe ser escuchada.
It means that all those people affected by environmental issues and contaminations and their voices need to be addressed and taken into account.
En segundo lugar, debo señalar que la justicia ambiental implica la garantía del acceso a un sistema judicial, ¿sí? Jueces expertos en dirimir conflictos ambientales.
I have also to highlight that the right for environmental justice has to do with access to a justice system and judges specialized in environmental issues to solve these types of conflicts.
Esos conflictos ambientales que llegan a ser resueltos por los jueces tienen que ver con diversos intereses.
Those conflicts that are solved by judges have to do with different interests.
Inclusive esos intereses están referidos al uso, al manejo o a la conservación, por ejemplo, de la biodiversidad.
Even the use, the management of and the protection of biodiversity.
También debo señalar que la justicia ambiental tiene que ver con algo fundamental de lo cual se está discutiendo en este momento, y es la distribución igualitaria y equitativa de las cargas y los beneficios ambientales.
I also need to highlight that environmental justice has to do with a current topic nowadays that has to do with the distribution of environmental justice.
Aquí nos preguntamos, ¿de quiénes son esas cargas, por ejemplo, de los impactos negativos de los proyectos?
We have to ask ourselves, who are those burdens of the impact of these environmental issues, conflicts?
Y en este sentido también un tema muy importante del cual se discute mucho hoy en Colombia y es el tema de los beneficios económicos.
And then an important topic that is debated today in Colombia has to do with the economic benefits.
En este sentido, podríamos decir que hay que tener en cuenta también el enfoque diferencial.
We need to take into account the differential approach.
¿A quién afecta, por ejemplo, la contaminación electromagnética, la contaminación del aire? ¿Será que afecta más a los niños y a las personas adultas?
Who does electromagnetic contamination affect? Is it possible that it affects more children than adults?
La falta de agua, ¿a quién afecta? ¿A las mujeres?
The lack of water that is affect to women.
¿Cuál es el papel de las mujeres en esta materia? Entonces el enfoque diferencial también lo vemos aquí. Y por último, la implementación de un modelo administrativo estatal y económico sostenible. Eso implica que la justicia ambiental es un gran reto para el Estado.
Then, what is the role that women played in this respect and the role of the state and the national justice in all these issues?
Bueno, el origen de este concepto viene desde Estados Unidos, viene desde las movilizaciones que se dieron como consecuencia precisamente de temas como el relleno sanitario de comunidades discriminadas por este tipo de proyectos.
The origin of this concept comes from the USA precisely, and also the sanitary projects.
Es el despertar de la sociedad hacia reclamar por sus derechos, hacia reclamar por unas condiciones ambientales justas y equitativas para la comunidad.
It is the awakening of society and their right to protest for their rights.
Estas condiciones eran desproporcionadas, efectivamente, para los más pobres, para los que tienen peores condiciones de vida.
These conditions were not proportional, mainly to poor people or people who have not the same access and opportunities.
Por eso es tan importante que tener en cuenta que las movilizaciones que se dieron en un primer momento tenían que ver con la necesidad de tomar acciones urgentes.
That is why it is important to take into account the protest where, I mean, the foundation, right, to bear in mind that there must to be actions to be taken.
Las manifestaciones que se dieron tenían que ver adicionalmente con la necesidad de que el Estado promoviera nuevas políticas, nuevas leyes y nuevas dinámicas socioambientales que permitieran superar todas estas problemáticas.
These protests reflected the need of the states to create policies and new dynamics to address all these issues.
Muy bien, pues alrededor de todo esto podríamos decir que actualmente la justicia ambiental implica grandes retos y retos no solamente para los estados, sino retos también para la sociedad civil.
So nowadays we can say that environmental justice represents several challenges, not only for the state, right, but also for people in general.
Los conflictos ambientales que se han dado, los diversos intereses, ¿sí? Algunos de protección, algunos de uso, algunos de manejo, ¿sí? Implican que se deben garantizar ciertos elementos importantes para lograr la justicia ambiental.
The conflicts around the use and the management has led us to take into account that there has to be several measures to be taken in order to guarantee environmental protection.
Miren ustedes cómo, en primer lugar, la gente quiere tener información previa a los proyectos.
People feel the need to have previous information before the projects.
Las comunidades no quieren enterarse de los proyectos cuando llega la maquinaria, cuando llegan los obreros, cuando llegan agentes externos.
Communities do not want to get to know about the projects once the whole machinery is set up. They want to know beforehand.
Además de que la información debe ser completa, debe ser oportuna, debe garantizar que la gente conozca lo que se quiere hacer en sus regiones, la gente quiere participación.
The information has to be accurate, precise, and people want to participate. And they want to know what the project is going to be about and what they are going to be doing in their regions.
Y la participación implica ser escuchados, que sus voces sean tenidas en cuenta, que sus expectativas, que sus preocupaciones sean tenidas en cuenta.
They also need their voices to be heard and also their expectations to be taken into account.
Y por supuesto, eso implica además un gran riesgo que se ha dado en nuestro país, es la protección de los líderes ambientales.
And it implies a great risk, that is the protection of environmental leaders.
Eso significa que podamos superar y garantizar que las personas que se dediquen a conservación puedan ejercer sus derechos sin ninguna intervención.
This means that all the people who are devoted to environmental, who are in charge and devoted to environmental issues can take action without any obstacle.
Miren ustedes, algo muy importante, que también sean reconocidos sus conocimientos ancestrales, que esas comunidades que ancestralmente han existido, han protegido los lugares de mayor riqueza biológica de nuestro país, sean tenidos en cuenta y podamos aprender de ellos esas estrategias especiales de conservación.
It's also very important to take into account the ancestral knowledge of the people from the region, and also that we can also get to know about those strategies, because those are the ones who know the most about the areas where they have always lived in.
Bueno, y por último voy a señalar que el uso económico de muchos de esos recursos, de esos bienes ambientales que existen en este momento, tienen también implicaciones en temas de cambio climático. Por eso es tan importante tenerlo presente.
And it's also very important to highlight that the use of those resources has important implications.
Bueno, así las cosas, debo señalar de manera pertinente que en el caso que nosotros tenemos en nuestro país de justicia ambiental, se clama porque hayan acciones judiciales, acciones que nos permitan garantizar esa protección y esa justicia para todos los colombianos.
All the cases that we have in our country has to do with claiming for a legal system that addresses all those needs.
Adicionalmente, se requiere que todas las comunidades de una u otra manera tengan la posibilidad de ¿qué? Tengan la posibilidad, por supuesto, de contar con elementos para garantizar la justicia ambiental. Y aquí vemos algunos casos de Colombia, casos que han involucrado, por ejemplo, comunidades indígenas o afrodescendientes.
It is also important to make sure that all these communities have the necessary tools, right, to address issues in their communities of environmental justice. Here we have some cases that from Colombia.
Gloria, perdón, disculpa, ¿podrías hacernos el favor de cerrar esa caja naranjada ahí? Solo si haces clic entiendo o entendido, creo que se cierra.
Perfecto. Sí, muy
Muchas
bien.
gracias.
Quisiera señalar además que todos estos casos, muchos de los casos que hemos tenido en nuestro país que han involucrado el concepto de justicia ambiental, han tenido que ver con litigio estratégico.
All the cases, many of the cases that we have had in Colombia that had involved environmental justice has had to do with litigation.
Y miren ustedes que para lograrlo las comunidades han tenido diversas estrategias.
And the communities have had different strategies to achieve this.
La utilización de redes, internet.
The use of social networks, I mean the networks, internet.
La realización de marchas y movilizaciones sociales donde toda la comunidad sale a reclamar por sus derechos.
Social protests in which the whole community protests for their rights.
Y miren, adicionalmente a las tomas que las comunidades hacen de estos procesos, también tenemos algo fundamental, y es que han visto como solución que los jueces resuelvan sus conflictos.
And also these communities have seen as the only solution to have judge solve these issues.
Aquí vemos algunos de esos conflictos, por ejemplo, que tienen que ver con temas de rellenos sanitarios, como el caso de Jaragüey, ¿sí? Una comunidad indígena. Un tema que tiene que ver con transporte marítimo, con la aplicación del principio de precaución, ¿sí? En el caso también de Corales del Rosario.
So here we can see different cases, for example, Paraguay community case that has to do with maritime transportation.
Aquí entonces es evidente que el modelo de desarrollo que se ha implementado, ¿sí? Lo que ha hecho es promover el uso indiscriminado de recursos sin tener en cuenta ni los derechos de esta generación ni de las generaciones futuras.
The model that has been implemented has been did not take it into account the future of not only this generation but also future ones.
Sí. Las comunidades, por ejemplo, han tenido que ver que se desvían sus ríos para poder llevar a hidroeléctricas, ¿sí? El agua, dejándolos a ellos sin agua para consumo humano.
Communities have seen how the river flows have been interrupted in order to set up hydroelectric dams, leaving them without the water resource.
Así entonces, la solución de este tipo de conflictos desde la justicia ambiental implica, en primer lugar, el que nosotros podamos tener, ¿sí? Acciones judiciales que nos permitan la defensa de ese derecho.
So here we can see that the solution to address these environmental justice issues is to have access to the law system.
Y miren que además está la importancia de tener quienes ayuden a las comunidades a la defensa de sus derechos, por ejemplo, los organismos de control.
I mean, control organisms to help for the fight for those rights are also important.
A eso se une algo fundamental que es el tema de la garantía de la participación, del acceso a la información y de procesos sancionatorios a quienes afecten esos derechos.
Then it's also important to have access to information, a punishing system to those people who do not follow those regulations.
Así entonces, el consentimiento, la consulta previa, la participación, la información se constituyen en elementos muy importantes para garantizar la justicia ambiental y para solucionar los conflictos ambientales.
Consultation, prior information, participations, those are key elements to guarantee environmental justice.
Quedo entonces abierta a que miremos los casos y que en el conversatorio podamos ampliar algunos de estos temas.
So I'm open to questions and to see these cases, and probably during the debate questions we can debate about these cases in Colombia.
Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Gloria, de verdad. Thank you so much. We really appreciated your presentation. And now I'd like to pass it to Dr. Kashwan to share his screen as well as present to the crowd.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. As many of the issues that came up in Dr. Gloria Rodriguez's presentations will also show up in an interesting way in my talk. And I want to, as I mentioned earlier, this is an attempt to see the ways in which the framework of environmental justice can be used to understand the kind of challenges that many communities face in parts of South Asia. And I want to start by sort of making this kind of comparison between race and caste. In recent times, there's been this very popular book as well as the movie based on a book about sort of connecting caste and race together. And when Black Lives Matter movement stood up in the US, there were many Dalit activists in India who sort of used the same sort of framework of Dalit Lives Matter. So increasingly, there have been a lot of these discussions comparing and connecting caste and class. But the way in which the framework of race has been used by environmental justice movement here in the US has not been the case in India. The environmental justice movement in India, or at least the scholarly discussions of environmental justice, it relates mostly to extractive projects and forestry conservation project. So many of the conservation issues that Dr. Rodriguez mentioned in her presentation are the dominant ways in which the reference to environmental justice is made in the Indian context and South Asia more broadly. Having said that, caste is really an important piece of the discussion on substantive concerns of environmental justice, even though they've not, sort of shown up so much in the scholarly literature and even in the movement around environmental justice. So you see how I'm using the framework to sort of talk about environmental justice issues, even though it's not a movement in the same way as it is in the US. So a few years back, the New York Times did an interactive feature and a big sort of story on looking at how two different students in Delhi are affected by air pollution. As you know, Delhi is one of the world's most polluted cities. And so New York Times talked to a bunch of researchers, and their reporters did a fantastic job of following a 24-hour schedule of these two students. And the student on the left, as you see, is a lower income family from a lower income family who lives in the slums. And the student on the right is from a rich family. And they, the journalist followed these two students throughout the day and kept measurements of the kind of pollution that they were being exposed to. Now, irony here, as you see in this picture, is that The lower income family, which has a much lower carbon footprint and some of the environmental friendly lifestyles, they are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the extreme pollution in Delhi, while the rich population and their children are sort of protected. They have air pollution filters at home, and they drive in nice cars, and their schools are much nicer, also protected against pollution, while some of the lower income students actually study in the open air, under the bridges and so forth. And so this is the dark line that you see here is Monu, who's the student on the left-hand side, his pollution exposure, while the lighter line on the bottom is from the student on the right, who's a student from the higher income. So you see a dramatic difference between that pollution exposure, especially during the morning hours and evening hours when it is sort of cooking time, and when the lower income communities are extremely filled of smoke and extremely polluted. Now, the interesting part is that the researchers who research environmental pollution have very little sort of exposure to these questions of environmental justice. So this is quoting from the New York Times report that they did. And the researchers acknowledge that we haven't really thought so much about the demographics and their social categories and who's affected by the pollution. They simply measure the pollution, and they're keeping track of pollution, during the day and throughout the year at different seasons and so forth. So, and the point that I want to communicate here, which is very, very important, and sometimes researchers sort of fail to appreciate, that even though researchers can look at this problem from an EJ framework, the broader community of scientific research and policymakers and business community, they really have no sort of exposure to these kinds of discussions, and so it doesn't become a society-wide discussion in the same way, at least in a relative sense, as it has become in the context of the U.S. So air pollution is one problem. Water crisis and heat waves are two other big climate problems where caste and gender play a huge role. As you know, intersectional identity makes a real difference in terms of who does what kind of work. And so women have almost always are the ones who are bringing drinking water and other water supply needed for a household from at least a mile, at least a kilometer away, and sometimes a mile away from where they live. And so the burden of water scarcity as well as heat stress falls disproportionately on women, and especially on Dalit women, who are doubly disadvantaged within the social system. Heat waves similarly exposes Dalits more than other parts of the Indian community. And just to give you a sense of numbers here, the population of Dalits is anywhere between 250 million, so probably more than 300 million, because we haven't had a census data released for many, many years now. But there are about 300 million Dalits in India, and there are about 120 million indigenous population in India. And so the heat stress and the water stress is felt most strongly about 250 million Dalits in India. I mentioned the sort of the intersectional nature of these problems. And so what you see on the screen here is a traditional water harvesting structure from the Himalaya region. And these are, fantastic quality water resources, connected directly to the mountain ecosystem. And they are cared for by local communities because they are attached to religious practices and so forth. But because these are religiously attached structure, they also are sites of exclusion and oppression. So in many of these kinds of water structures, Dalits and women, menstruating women cannot access these places because of the notions of purity and impurity attached to them. And many times when Dalits aren't able to access these resources, they have to travel farther in remote corners. And because of those additional travels and, having to travel into remote parts of the forest and hills, many times they are exploited. Young girls, are also exploited because they have to sort of, go get water for the family. And so this, again, is a way in which we can understand the intersectional nature of environmental and climate justice in India. And we have recently started some scholarly work on this. But again, as I said, in the mainstream environmental policy and climate policy, these discussions are only beginning to be taken up. And so more broadly speaking, the caste dimension, and I deliberately didn't talk about what the caste system is and how it works, because I wouldn't be able to do justice in the short time that we have here. But this is an artist depiction of the way in which the oppressive reality of caste is sort of all encompassing. So what you see here is the earth is shown as being woven with the sacred thread that is identified with the Brahmin identity. And so, and the tree is part of the, sort of the environmental angle is brought in through the tree, and a young intercaste couple had to hang themselves. This is based on a real story where they had to commit suicide because they were being charged by, and they were being chased and attacked by upper caste goons in one of the big North Indian states. And this is not to play, sort of caste Dalit people purely as victims. They have strong movements and agency, and there's been historical leadership. In the center of this diagram, you see Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, who was a towering figure of Indian leader. He was a constitutional scholar, a double PhD from Columbia University, and one of the top, I think, King's College London, or one of these places in London School of Economics, I think. And he gave this message of Dalit empowerment, both through education and organization. And this is, again, a depiction of the Dalit empowerment movement, where education and control over resources and political movement has become an important sort of part of the Indian political system. But again, unfortunately, the Dalit movement is yet to connect with the environmental movement, and the environmental movement is yet to connect with the Dalit movement. So they remain sort of, separate movements by and large. There are some efforts being made, but in the main, these movements are sort of disconnected, and hoping that in future, we will see more of a sort of connection between these movements. So with that, Dalit question, as I mentioned here, has not been part of the main discussions of environmental justice in India. Environmental justice has come up mainly in the context of forestry conservation projects, which have led to displacement of indigenous people and other rural communities, mining projects, which have also similarly led to displacement of indigenous communities and other rural communities. Interestingly enough, the question of mining labor has not been a big part of this discussion on EJ. And that's where many of the Dalits who migrate to these mining areas and also migrate to urban areas like Delhi, they are affected by many of these same environmental questions. But that part of the migration and labor is yet to become part of the research on environmental justice in the Indian context and the global South context more broadly. And again, there have been movements, women's land rights movement, who are, in some cases, they are being supported by state government policies. So this is an analysis from three of the main environmental movements in India, historically speaking, the Chipko movement and the Save Silent Valley movement and the Narmada Bachao movement, or the movement against the Narmada Dam. And what this analysis shows is that all three of these movements have been led and controlled quite significantly by higher caste, middle class activists, environmental activists. And what that means is that when we think about mainstreaming environmental justice questions within environmental movement, it will not happen readily, because the way in which the movements have framed their demands, their arguments, have been shaped heavily by the upper caste and middle class concerns, and these are movements of environmental protection. So you will hear a frame called environmentalism of the poor. If we do a deeper sort of sociological power analysis of that frame, it sort of puts the onus of protecting the environment on poor people without taking a sufficient amount of focus on the extractive practices of the corporations and how the policies of the state shape those extractive practices. So with that, I want to sort of talk very briefly about this comparative framework that we have developed in the course of research over past several years. And part of this argument is that when we want to understand how environmental justice is taken up in the mainstream political process and policy process, we have to look at a number of factors which are listed on the left-hand side column. So, taking on from the US environmental justice history, which is reliant and draws on both the political elements of civil rights movements, but also draws on the legacy of civil rights law and the jurisprudence surrounding that, the nature of the EJ advocacy and movement, the way in which environmental justice concerns have been institutionalized within the policies, both at the federal level and the state level, and the extent to which there is certain level of institutional accountability about whether EPA or other state level agencies are addressing the problem of environmental justice or not. And if we sort of look through the 30-year-long history of more of the EJ movement in the US, we see that to some extent, each of these questions have been addressed. Accountability, EPA, as you know, recently took out these decisions about stopping the EJ investigation into the Louisiana State Department of Environmental Protection. And again, movements are standing up and challenging them in various political processes and even in the courts. So that kind of institutionalization and institutional accountability is completely missing from the Indian discussions of environmental justice. And so the attempts to sort of, portray a global EJ movement, because there are these kinds of EJ struggles all over the world, are important as a framing device. But if we really want to understand whether the EJ problems and challenges can be addressed in different contexts, then we have to actually look at the nature of institutionalization, the legal framework, the rule of law framework. And there is a great deal of difference between the US context and the global South context in most places, including in Asia and particularly in Africa. So, and this is a sort of, pictorial depiction of the same diagram, but just to say, accounting for differences of historical context, social context, and the context of social legal environment is really extremely important for understanding how EJ works in different contexts. So I'll stop there, and hopefully there's about a minute or two to take some questions if there are any. But thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kashwan. That was a really great presentation. And I'll say that I love the piece that you mentioned about how pollution, air quality is reduced during cooking time. That's something that we see here in the United States, for example, in gas-powered slum-like apartment communities. So that was a really great point that even over here, we could identify with some of our struggles. Next, I think we're going to move on directly to Dr. Marquez. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you to all the colleagues for sharing this wonderful perspective. I'm going to have a little bit of a different approach today, because part of my approach is, one, to frame this discussion with how we've also included a new pedagogical approach to training next generation leaders to tackle environmental justice and climate justice issues, and that is through the Global Colombia Collaboratory. And then specifically, I want to talk about some of the work we're doing then with partners in the Gambia, which is a very, very small country in West Africa that is disproportionately impacted by a number of environmental justice and climate justice challenges. And I'll only frame a few of these problems today for context. So I want to get started by kind of allowing us to understand that when we approach this from a pedagogical standpoint, we're empowering students from all over the world to think about the connection between the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and their place in society. And this is a co-curricular activity that's not really required for a class, but has really spearheaded a lot of challenge-based education, complementary and collaborative projects with NGOs on the ground. We currently use this pedagogical approach for work in environmental justice and sustainability in Brazil, Cuba, and the Gambia. It has allowed us to really think about the intercultural context, how we are collaborating to make an impact, working to support the most vulnerable in society, really helping students think about their place in the world and how to take action and learn about very pressing issues, but also thinking about those competencies and skills that shape next generation leaders. So with that in mind, I want to talk about some of the work we've been doing then in the Gambia, which is a very small country in West Africa. The Gambia is totally encircled by Senegal, with the exception of its westernmost coast, which is only about 40 miles north to south. East to west, the country is about 110 miles. As a blow up here, you can see this sliver of a country that ethnically, actually, the Senegambia region is only divided through colonization. So from the beginning, when you start thinking about the dynamics that exist, why things are the way they are, the fact that these areas were colonized by the French and the British respectively kind of impacts how things have the positionality of some of the environmental justice issues that occur in the present context. I'm going to talk a bit about this area on the southern west coast, Gunjur, where there's quite a bit of lively activity related to conservation, sustainability, and environmental justice. Our partners on the ground there have been very active in the EJ movement, but also in conservation and ecotourism. The livelihood of these areas along the western coast has been largely related to tourism. They were once pristine areas. As I mentioned in previous slides, our work in the collaboratory has actually focused in some similar regions, both in the Amazon in Brazil, and then also most recently in Cuba. And in each case, we're working with local NGOs who have been disproportionately impacted by many EJ challenges and climate justice challenges. So for this work in the Gambia, two particular activists, which I'm just here representing this story today, and this effort to really bring visibility. But my colleagues, Ahmed Majang and Lamin Jassi, have been on the front line of this issue, and there are lots of resources to share that I'm delighted to talk more about, because we'd love to have more engaged in this work. So one major issue has evolved based on foreign interests in fishing in the region, and specifically, the Chinese have set up fish meal production factories and companies along the coast, where they are depleting the fishing and polluting the environment. Unfortunately, due to the economic circumstances, government and others have been engaged in, at some point, allowing a certain degree of latitude for these foreign interests in exchange for economic impacts or the promise of jobs. But ultimately, the local communities have been impacted by the overfishing. It's affected trade, but also food security. Sardinella, which is locally called the bunga fish, which used to be a staple food for many in West Africa, is increasingly not available because it's used and processed for fish meal that is used for other purposes. And so these foreign entities have come in to basically deplete and exploit the fishing stock. And in fact, if you think about just the mere nature of all this and the fact that it's not even a circular economy. This is really used for aquafeed and other purposes, other sectors. So the Chinese feed mills in West Africa have really decimated communities. In addition to depleting the fish species, notoriously, these facilities have noise, bad smells, pollution of local bolongs and estuaries and streams and ocean areas, as well as reserved forests that are very biodiverse ecosystems. I mentioned the food insecurity issues, which are not only impacting nutrition, but again, because many of these coastal communities, their livelihoods are all associated with the business and the practice of fishing. So what you have now is a shift in really the possibility for the next generation not able to sustain themselves through fishing because of the overfishing that has occurred. Many of these facilities are operating without waste treatment plants, and they are discharging wastewater directly into the sea or to nearby streams and estuaries. These large industrial trawlers are owned and hired by foreign fish meal companies, and they threaten the long-term availability of fish, and they're also very elusive. So it's very difficult from a compliance standpoint to really put your finger on who is behind it, because when you try to board these vessels, and there's a wonderful documentary I'll give you the link for, you'll see that the manifest and the foreign interest in the vessels themselves are very elusive. They often hire locals who then are getting an economic benefit, and many are from these communities, but they actually don't understand what's at stake. The other thing that's occurring is spoiled fish is dumped and washes up on beaches. So there are fish kills that make these areas that were pristine and used for ecotourism unconducive for tourists to swim now. They can no longer be marketed, which is another area of livelihood and development, particularly for young Gambians who have become entrepreneurs and have really developed ecotourism as a livelihood. The favored beaches for tourists have now been turned into ghost beaches due to the damage done by the environment, done to the environment. And as I mentioned, the impacts on ecotourism in the West Coast region have been significant. So the status of things is really converging. The fishing vessels themselves, the impacts on the coastal community, the unsustainable practices of overfishing to create fish meal, and the social impacts, including the loss of livelihoods, not just for youth and families engaged in fishing as a livelihood, but also the women who have been impacted. Many of them have small cottage businesses and industries such as smoking fish or trading fish that they can no longer engage in. There's been a lot of corruption and impact associated with local law enforcement who have attacked journalists and activists who are trying to bring light to these issues in the local community. My colleagues themselves have all been detained as a result of really trying to advocate for their communities. And then another tremendous challenge associated with this problem directly is illegal migration. And this is bidirectional. There's illegal migration because there are individuals who are moving into these areas to be a part of the industry, and they're contracted to do so. But more importantly, due to the impact on fishing as a livelihood, what we are seeing is young people in particular now resorting to very drastic measures to seek a better opportunity. Most recently in July, approximately 150 people went missing when a migrant boat left illegally from this West Coast. This is a treacherous journey where these boats sail toward the Canary Islands, with hopes of a better opportunity. And it's directly linked to the loss of livelihood as a result of this environmental justice issue that we are seeing not only young men, but women and children also risking their lives for this journey. There's been a lot of activity and disruption associated with this as well. Here's a headline where in a nearby community of Sanyang, also on the western coast, the local youth basically set the place on fire because how this has been affecting the local community and how their voices have not been heard. And so violence is not something that people want to resort to, but you can imagine how passionate people are about this when they're not only losing their livelihood, but now they're in a polluted environment and foreign interests do not have their best interests at heart when it comes to making sure that these areas remain pristine. To summarize the environmental impacts, aside from the fish kills and the rotting fish that literally are just sitting there, the improper waste management, the destruction of marine ecosystems, which you can imagine in underserved areas, there is not much data. So through citizen science, one of the projects we've been working on with CTAG is how to collect this information. And some of the obstacles we've run into is actually government fearing the engagement of citizen scientists in collecting this data because it just exposes how deep these relationships and this negotiating has gone. Understanding that one can track the depletion of these ecosystems, one can really look at the data and understand how much of these specific fish species are impacted, but there are many, many barriers when one tries to simply collect the data. And finally, the improper land management, mapping and zoning. So many of these facilities have literally cropped up in communities and then along the fence line. The odor, the noise, the spoiled and rotten fish, the impact, as I said, on local businesses and tourism has been indiscriminate. Here is a photo of one of the local bolongs or estuary systems that has been largely contaminated from the discharge from the local fish meal factory, literally turning the stream red. And then from time to time, periodically, there are fish kills associated with this. We've also noticed the mangrove systems in the area are also beginning to die off. And there's no concern for this in relation to this challenge. To summarize the economic impacts, as I mentioned, corruption and bribery largely then are fostering this illegal act, the impacts on tourism, impacts on agriculture, because in many of these areas nearby, women's development and livelihood have been impacted, particularly in horticultural gardening. And as I mentioned, in the mangrove systems where oysters are actually harvested from these mangroves. So once they're polluted from the fish meal factories, that activity is impacted. And as I mentioned, the bribery and corruption and the data collection barriers that seem to be surfacing really relate to wanting to take a deeper dive, looking at the fishing agreements and how they have been put together from government and exposing this. And so this actually relates to the barriers as well. So there's a lot of activity, a huge number of activists from all walks of life who've been focused on addressing these local challenges, considering the depletion of the natural resources, but also in the face of climate change, which already leaves them a bit behind. So the scramble to try to right this wrong is an imperative. I want to encourage us, because I know I didn't have much time, to look at a very provocative documentary that features our colleagues from Gunjur, focused on how fish meal production is destroying Gambia's water. It was a piece done by the New Yorker a few years ago and goes into great detail discussing everything from the foreign interests, the elusiveness of these fishing trawlers, the impact on the local community. And then I also want to summarize that the environmental justice movement is embedded in efforts to attack climate justice and even conservation issues. The work of CTAG as a community-based citizen science organization has been phenomenal. And they've done everything from community outreach, environmental education in K through 12 schools, to beach patrols tackling poaching, networking, and advocacy. They support also women's development and the impact that this is having on horticultural and farming activities, a very lively erosion control activity related to trees for schools and planting coconut trees, not only in schools, but also along these areas that are decimated also due to erosion and climate change. They have begun to develop an indigenous tree nursery, trying to preserve the indigenous knowledge and linking this to health and wellness, understanding that with the demographic shift from looking at infectious disease impacts to non-communicable diseases, there needs to be more of a reliance on the old way, the indigenous medicinal uses that used to exist in their communities. So as these areas are being decimated by the illegal practices, whether it is illegal logging or illegal sand mining, you see a photo there where, again, foreign interests and other interests are coming in and decimating these areas by taking the mining. This is also impacting health because there's a need, more of a reliance in this resource poor setting to rely on more traditional medicine, which is largely related to, again, the indigenous trees. And finally, beach monitoring, addressing poaching and conservation. They have a very lively sea turtle monitoring program where they are trying to give sea turtles a head start, understanding what environmental impacts are affecting the species, whether it's the pollution itself or the beach erosion, which is making it difficult for turtles to actually come ashore and nest, and why it is that so many of these hatchlings, so many of the eggs do not survive. And so they spent a lot of time using telescience, telebiology with scientists from around the world giving advice on how to curate a conservation program that is preserving the sea turtle species along these same areas. With that, I want to thank you for your attention. Happy to answer many, many questions. As I mentioned, I am just here representing many colleagues who are partnering in this effort, and I hope that this is giving you a glimpse of the environmental justice issues in these areas in West Africa that do not get much attention on the global stage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marquez. Really excellent presentation, and I'm definitely gonna watch the how fish meal destroyed the Gambian water, the river system. That's definitely on my watch list. Thank you for bringing that up. It's always devastating when people whose practices have sustained them for thousands of years are all of a sudden changed due to just predatory practices. So thank you for bringing light to all those issues. And I want to now pass the word to our final presenter, Anahira, and it's all you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, greetings to you all. Toitu te marae a tāne, toitu te marae a tangaroa, toitu te tangata. If the land is well and the sea is well, the people will thrive. Ko mauao me tararua o ku maunga, ko tauranga me raukawa o ku moana, ko waitao me parirua o ku awa, he hiri hau no tainoi mātātua me tākitimu. Mauao and tararua are my mountains, tauranga and raukawa are my oceans, waitao and parirua are my rivers. I am descended from the great canoes of Tainoi, Mātātua and Tākitimu. Kia ora everyone. Again, my name is Anahira Nin, and I'm very honoured to have the opportunity to speak to you all and share some insights on the environmental justice context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, specifically focused on Māori communities, the Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa. As I mentioned previously, I lead Indigenous climate policy for the Ministry for the Environment of the New Zealand Government, and then have a few other roles that enable me to keep progressing better outcomes for my communities. I am Māori. The Māori people are Indigenous to Aotearoa, which is the Indigenous name for New Zealand. I belong to several different tribes all over New Zealand and therefore different landscapes. To set the context, Māori see Papa Tuanuku, or Mother Earth, as a living being, and our landmarks as ancestors. The granting of legal personhood to the Urewera forests, Wanganui River, and most recently Taranaki Mountain in Aotearoa demonstrates this. We see our people as part of this circular, holistic ecosystem where our actions will have an impact intergenerationally. So understanding who we are and our connection to the world around us informs how we might engage with it and take part in it. You'll see in this picture my grandfather Bucknan, who was a contemporary Māori artist. His work was drawn from Māori carving, weaving, and traditional meeting house patterns, and often depicted Mother Earth as a living, breathing being. His art was the land and the land was his art. So the motifs included in this presentation are his works to reiterate to you all the importance of the Indigenous and intergenerational lens to the environmental justice conversation. Now, there's some further context that I think will assist with your understanding of the environmental justice issues Aotearoa New Zealand faces, as well as the solutions and strategies being utilised to address these issues. Number one, we're a small island-based nation in the heart of the Pacific, in case you might not know where we are, and we're a nation highly susceptible to natural hazards and are already experiencing the impacts of climate change on our communities, as demonstrated by Cyclone Gabriel early last year. Number two, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, forms the constitutional foundation for Aotearoa New Zealand. It creates a basis for our government to provide protections and acknowledgements to Māori rights and interests within shared citizenry for all New Zealanders. And finally, Indigenous environmental justice goes beyond the anthropocentric lens and considers relations across all living things, specifically those between Indigenous communities and the ancestral natural world. It recognises the holistic worldview I spoke about before, as well as the unique experiences of Indigenous communities and their collective trauma under colonialism. In short, think in intergenerational, pluralistic, and relational terms. What you see on the screen is part of the Our Land 2024 report developed by the Ministry for the Environment and Stats NZ. The report explored the state of Aotearoa New Zealand's natural assets and infrastructure. What it fails to mention is how the impacts of a degrading environment are distributed across New Zealand communities, specifically Māori communities. Key issues for our communities across environmental justice include a lack of procedural access across the environmental system, a lack of information about distributional impacts in our communities, limited to no ability to be involved in the management and also decision-making over our natural assets, and little recognition of our Indigenous knowledge systems, values, and culture within the environmental system. So, what's the aspiration for Māori within the environmental justice conversation? For Māori communities, this is tino rangatiratanga, having the ability to make decisions about their treasures, including their lands, waters, and people. In particular, I'd like to focus on several strategies and actions being undertaken to address these issues and progress tino rangatiratanga. On balance, I do believe procedural access for Māori communities to Aotearoa New Zealand, New Zealand's environmental system is quite progressive. For example, the way the New Zealand government develops policy also requires us to consider the Treaty of Waitangi impacts. There are also several pieces of legislation that include treaty clauses. The Resource Management Act is such a law and is New Zealand's primary natural resource allocation and decision-making law. It includes provisions to protect environmental assets that Māori value and a number of procedural provisions requiring consideration of traditional Māori law and consultation with Māori in decision-making process. However, there are still huge challenges to Māori tribes being meaningfully engaged given lack of funding, time and capacity. This is why many tribes are investing in the proactive management of their rights and interests. So you'll see on the picture on the left, that shows the current environmental and cultural team of my tribe Ngāti Tō Rangatira, who are dedicated to upholding and advocating for our tribal rights and interests by actively participating across the resource management system and using our Indigenous knowledge systems, Mātauranga Māori, to co-manage our lands and waters. The picture on the right is from a couple of years ago when I was in that team, and we were participating in a select committee process where we provided an oral submission on an incoming change to the Resource Management Act. Another strategy is relationship investment. I've been lucky enough to have worked at the local and regional level for tribes in Aotearoa. This includes working for Ngāti Tōrangatira, as mentioned before, a tribe which has rights and interests over the bottom of the North Island and the top of the South Island. This tribe holds relationships with local and central government authorities that have required investment on both sides. It has resulted in unique working partnerships that enable Ngāti Tōrangatira to further exercise kaitiakitanga or guardianship over their lands and waters, resulting in better outcomes for all. And what you see pictured here is an example of that partnership, where elected councillors across 3 local councils were inducted by Ngāti Tōrangatira at the start of their term in our Marae Tribal Meeting House. Another strategy being enacted across Aotearoa, New Zealand, involves Māori communities and tribes rowing their own waka, or canoes, towards their vision and proactively creating better holistic outcomes for the tribe and wider communities. An example of this again comes from my tribe, Ngāti Tōrangatira. For context, the heart of our tribe is within Porirua, the city where I currently live. Porirua, once a bustling centre of wealth and trade, became a social housing experiment town where they developed fast housing and infrastructure at the cost of our environment and harbour in the 80s. It has resulted in ageing and failing infrastructure, damp, cold housing, and a degrading harbour that gets raw sewage every time there's a storm. Ngāti Tōrangatira have taken this issue into our own hands and developed a circular economy within the property development and housing space. We've developed vertical and horizontal sustainable value supply chains at place to develop an approach to healthy, sustainable, resilient, intergenerational housing at low cost and least environmental impact for our communities within Porirua and across the rest of our areas of interest. This action Ngāti Tōrangatira is taking contributes to the vision our rangatahi or young people developed last year for our lands, waters and people, which brings us to our final key strategy or learning. Develop a vision for your community and let it guide you. So when I spoke about rowing your own waka, it also means knowing where you're going. What you see on the screen shows you our vision for our lands, waters and people. For context, my cousin and I developed and led a 3-day climate discussion, or wānanga as we call it, for young people descended from 3 closely linked tribes. This resulted in the depiction you see in front of you, the aspirations of the young people for our lands, waters and people. To provide you with some understanding, given the aspirations are detailed in a mixture of English and Te Reo Māori, I'll highlight some specific examples from the board. So you'll see that there are many healthy sea and land life depicted on the board, showing that our forests, wetlands, seas, rivers and harbours are healthy. There's a keenness to enable more opportunities for cultural revitalisation and connection. And one particular one that I love is this transition to a koha-based or reciprocity-based economy. Now, this vision demonstrates several things. Frontline communities know what they want for themselves and they understand what self-determination looks like to them. And environmental justice doesn't just focus on environmental outcomes, but social, health, economic as well, and for everyone. Now, while I've outlined our general operating context, Aotearoa, New Zealand is undergoing some challenging political issues that directly impact and regress Māori rights and interests. It is getting so challenging that a collective statement from global Indigenous leaders was issued to the New Zealand government last month on the proposed Treaty Principles Bill, an incoming bill that aims to replace and repeal treaty clauses from legislation. This example of solidarity from global Indigenous leaders mirrors the exact message our recently passed Māori King, Kingi Tūheitia Pōtatau Te Whirowhiro Te Tōwhitu, Moi Mai Rai Te Araki, provided us over the course of this challenging political context, kotahitanga or unity. It is through opportunities like this symposium, this panel, where we can come together, connect, share and unify to continue progressing environmental justice for all communities. Nō reira, hiranui tō tātou whare, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for your time and feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to know more about our context or more about the issues that we face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anahira. And I love the constant artworks that were featured in your presentation throughout. And the fight that the Maori community is engaged in is really inspiring. And I know for a fact that some of those practices, some of those ideas, I'll try to embed in the work that I'm doing here with my organization. But anyways, we're about 1 minute left. In order to respect the time, I'm going to close us all out. But before we go, I want to ask all of you in 1 or 2 sentences, if you could just share and you connect it to the specific examples that you gave, those specific communities, what would environmental justice look like? It's huge, huge topic, huge question. But if you could just close with what would that environmental justice finally look like for the communities that you represent, study, and are a part of? Just to speedline it, Anahira, will you share?
For all our communities at place, I'll go back to what I said in my presentation. It's tino rangatiratanga. It's self-determining and enabling our communities to actually determine their own futures at place. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Marquez?
Yes, thank you for the question. Environmental justice would really look like everyone, regardless of ethnicity or income, having the right to the same environmental protections and benefits, as well as meaningful involvement in the policies that are shaping their own communities.
Love that response and really identify with that. Dr. Kashwan?
Thank you, Jose. For the indigenous population, people of India, indigenous resource sovereignty and territorial autonomy is an important consideration. For Dalits that I mentioned, dignity of life, we are at a level where we really need to be working toward enabling a dignified life for these 250, 300 million people. And that would be the main first goal of environmental justice considerations.
Perfect. Gloria, hice la última pregunta. Si brevemente podrían hablar un poco en 1 o 2 frases. ¿A qué se parece? ¿Cómo se ve justicia ambiental en Colombia, en tu región?
Bueno, en Colombia la justicia ambiental se ve como una gran oportunidad de resolver múltiples conflictos que existen en nuestro país.
It's like a
En
great
especial,
opportunity to solve different conflicts from our country.
sí, en especial todo lo que tiene que ver con el reconocimiento de los territorios para comunidades que los han utilizado para tareas de conservación.
Mainly the recognition of all those territories that have been used for conservation.
Esos
Excellent.
territorios son la vida,
Perdón.
son la cultura.
Those territories represent culture.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much. And anyone watching, throw your celebrations, throw your gratitude for all the panelists. Deeply honored to have been able to be here with all of you. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much. Take care.
Gracias.
You all.
Bye.
Bye.